Hey everybody, this is a quick update to let you know what's going on with video production, considering that the plans I had for this past week were basically demolished over the course of the week, and since some of that is going to be spilling over into the coming weeks, at least until I finish a couple of the projects that I'm working on, I wanted to go ahead and give you a heads up to expect more of the smaller kinds of videos on my channel until those are sorted out. Because I'm at the point where I know if I stop messing around with them and just set them aside for a while so I can work on other things, there is a very high likelihood that I will never actually end up going back to them, or I will end up going back to them and basically end up having to restart from square one because they are very long and involved games. And as such, I might have issues with forgetting what I was doing or having to basically relearn how to play the games or things like that. So what are these two major projects that have been throwing a monkey wrench into the works here? Well, I already teased one of them in my April Fool's video, which was Neo. I am actually working on a video of that. I'm still not sure if it's going to be a full review or an MTO, but based on how it's been going so far, I put way more time into it than I put into any other Souls-like game that I had played up until that point, and it has been looking like it might be one of the very first Souls-like games I actually end up doing a full review of. Because to date, the most I've done with any Souls-like title is to just do an MTO of it. So I've done a My Thoughts on video of Dark Souls Prepare to Die edition, which I made it something like 14-ish hours into the game, and I got too bored to continue. I made it a few hours into Bloodborne and did an MTO on that. Again, got really bored with it. I made an MTO on Lords of the Fallen after having played it for a few hours, and that one got me bored even more quickly than all of the others, because it's a pile of crap on top of just being generally boring. And then I included Code Vein in a multi-game MTO, because I really didn't have all that much to say about Code Vein, and I didn't make it very far into that one either. Oh yeah, and then there was Immortal Planet, which I did a My Thoughts on video of as well, but that one was in a pretty different perspective. It was more of an isometric game that had a lot of Souls-like trappings on it. But anyway, point is that I've never done a full review of any Souls-like game, and Neo was shaping up to be the first one of those. And a lot of that was down to Neo's combat system, which is flat out the best of any Souls-like game I've ever played. And before you say anything, no, I am not counting Sekiro as a Souls-like game, even though it does have some Souls-like elements to it. It has a very different playstyle, so I don't treat it as a Souls-like. Anyway, I was starting to get into a bit of a groove with Neo, at least being able to make progress, even if I wasn't necessarily enjoying it. It just depended on what was happening at the time. But then I got to the end of the second mission of the game, and thus the Hino Enma fight, which is a massive difficulty spike that comes out of nowhere, and it's really the only difficulty spike of that sort in the entire game from what I understand. It's specifically the kind of difficulty spike where it just kind of comes out of nowhere and is frankly just bullshit with the kind of stuff that that boss can do. So it's going to blindside you when it happens, and it's going to be immensely frustrating until you basically just whittle the boss down with an extremely slow and tedious fight. And that's really not conducive to the style of combat that Neo is going for. For those of you who haven't played it, it actually has a pretty fast and responsive combat system that definitely still is in the Souls-like playbook where you're having to rely a bit on iframes and things like that, but it actually has some really cool things going for it with the combo system and how fast and responsive the controls are compared to literally every other Souls-like that I've played. And while the combat was still nowhere near as enjoyable or satisfying as that of Severance Blade of Darkness, it actually still ended up being a pretty solid combat system overall, and I was actually starting to get into the groove of it a bit until the Hino Enma fight, and it just bogged everything down and made me absolutely certain at that point that I was probably never going to finish the game. Then I took the Hino Enma fight painfully slowly. The entire thing was extremely boring, and I finally got past it and continued on for several more hours with no real end in sight. As I'm talking right now, I have finished the Umibozu fight, and I'm moving on to the third area of the game, so I'm making some pretty steady progress in Neo. So hopefully we'll see a video on that pretty soon, and hopefully it will be a full review. But then there was the second game that threw an even bigger monkey wrench into the works than Neo did, and that is Elden Ring. Which has been a very weird experience, because there are certainly some things I really like about Elden Ring, which I'm not going to talk about in this video. But despite having messed around with Elden Ring for nearly twice as long as I've messed around with Nioh, I feel like I've actually made basically no progress at all. The only major bosses I've managed to beat thus far are Margit the Fell Omen and Leonine. And despite having a character that's nearly level 50 at this point, I still feel like I am woefully underpowered and woefully under-equipped for pretty much everything I'm fighting at this point. Certainly everything that I'm actually needing to go up against in order to get the amount of runes I need to be able to level up further. So at this point, it's basically a matter of me grinding out what I'm able to do in Elden Ring, and if that somehow manages to get me to the point where I can progress further, then maybe eventually you'll see a review of it, but it's leaning a lot more into the MTO territory than anything else. Nioh is still actually looking like it might be a full review, especially considering it's a hell of a lot shorter and much more condensed than Elden Ring is. But what I do know is that whether it ends up being an MTO for both of them, or for only one of them, or if both of them end up being full reviews, I need to get them done as soon as possible, because if I don't do that, if I set them aside, then I'll just have a bunch of footage sitting there collecting dust, and who knows how long it will take me to actually end up doing the videos on them. I certainly don't want to end up in the same situation I'm in with Pillars of Eternity, where I've had to restart that game something like 6 or 7 times now, and I just keep losing interest every single time. Which is incredibly irritating, because I want to do a video on Pillars of Eternity, and I especially want to do a video on its sequel, because the sequel is apparently a hell of a lot better. So while I still have the motivation, I want to stick with both Nioh and Elden Ring and get the videos on them done as soon as I can. Again, whether it ends up being MTOs or reviews or a mixture thereof. And since I'll be focusing almost exclusively on both of those until I get those videos done, you'll be seeing an uptick in what I call smaller content. So things like my thoughts on videos covering multiple games that I don't have much to say about individually, or my thoughts on videos or maybe even full reviews of games that are smaller and I don't have as much to say about, so they don't end up taking quite the same amount of time that it normally takes me to cover stuff like first-person shooters, role-playing games, etc. And of course, there will probably also be a few odds and ends thrown in here and there as well. So, the channel's content might be a bit sporadic over the next couple of weeks, at least as long as I'm working on Nioh and Elden Ring, but once I manage to sort those out, then hopefully we'll be back to a much more regular schedule. Well, as regular as the schedule on my channel gets anyway. As many of you know, but some of you may not be aware, I have a very limited amount of time where I can actually work on videos, and that interferes with things enough as is, and the works tend to get gummed up quite a bit more when I start working on much larger games like, say, Nioh, or especially something like Elden Ring, where it's absolutely massive. So we'll just have to wait and see what happens with those. I will certainly post updates on Twitter if there are any sorts of additional delays or anything like that. And of course there are still going to be the weekly updates on Patreon for those of you who are supporters on there, and those will give you an idea of what I'm working towards that particular week, except that the plans are going to be a bit looser than they normally are. And of course if you have questions or concerns, feel free to throw those my way and I'll answer them as soon as I can. But that's pretty much everything I wanted to cover at the moment. That's what's going on with the channel right now, what major projects I'm working on, and how they tend to gum up the works quite a bit. So thank you all for bearing with me while I'm working on these projects. Now, in case you can't tell from the way I sound, I'm really tired, so I'm going to go ahead and get some rest, and then I'll basically be getting right back to it. So thank you all very much for watching, and I'll see you all in later videos.